Today is the day that I finished listening to the audiobook of Investiture of the Gods. That is an ancient Chinese novel, and like the other Chinese novels I've talked about, this one is an absolute tome. I've said before that a short story by Russian standards is a short novel by American standards. Well, the Chinese have Russia beat out in terms of length of their classical novels. I think the longest thing I've ever read and completed was probably either Water Margin or Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Both of those two are classic Chinese novels. Longer than Moby Dick, longer than most Tolstoy books, longer than most Dostoevsky books. I think it's of comparable length to Solzhenitsyn, Gulag Archipelago, and Investiture of the Gods was a little bit shorter than those other two, Romance and Water Margin. But still, going into it, I knew full well it was going to be a months-long commitment. And sure enough, 1 or 2 episodes a day. This one took me, if I count back, I gotta think about it, probably about 4 months. And for most of that time, I wasn't really intending to do a full-on book review of that. The most I maybe would have done was one of those 1-minute long shorts like I do for a lot of books. But something about the end, the last couple episodes of this that I listened to, and by the way, when I talk about episodes, shout out to Chinese Lore Podcasts. That is the way that I've listened to all 3 of those classic Chinese novels that I mentioned. The guy who runs that YouTube channel has dedicated years of his life to translating and narrating the kinds of Chinese stories that he grew up with, but doing it for an American audience because, of course, these things, translations are not very popular. But despite the length of these books, they are good stories. But as I was saying, let's get into the plot. It's towards the tail end of the Shang dynasty in China. The reigning king of that dynasty, King Zhou, while paying homage to one particular goddess, one particular temple, makes a lustful remark about a statue depicting that goddess. This angers the goddess. The goddess sends 3 demons in human form to trap this king in a lust-filled delirium, such that he neglects official state business for months on end. Any advisor, any vassal who tries to say to him that he needs to actually go into court and conduct business, usually people who say those things to him end up dead. It gets to the point he's neglecting the state, that enough vassals decide that they're gonna join a growing rebellion. And then it gets to the point that takes up more than half of the novel, focusing on the growing army of the rebels, which includes a sizable collection of Taoist immortals, which in Chinese culture, they're sort of a trope that if you go and hide away and cultivate your Tao and separate yourself from earthly affairs, it is possible to develop magical powers, find magical artifacts, obtain some kind of secret knowledge, as well as literally extending your lifespan to eventually become immortal. But enough of these Taoists decided that, hey, this rebellion is the will of heaven, that they join in with the rebel army. I sat and listened through hours upon hours upon hours upon hours descriptions of battles, until finally they get to the capital city. The king finally realizes it's the end of the road for him. He commits suicide by burning himself alive. The 3 demons that kept the king in this lust-filled stupor, they get captured and executed, and that is the end of the Chinese Shang dynasty. From then on, a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, ascends and they reign for centuries. And oh yeah, this last part was a stylistic choice of the narrator. He decided to keep it a spoiler until the end that all the brave heroes, all the named characters who lost their lives in that war, well, their souls get to go up to heaven, which I have a feeling the Chinese conception of heaven is much different from the Western conception of heaven. But their souls get to go up to heaven, they become gods, which, again, I have a feeling the classical Chinese idea of God is much different from how a Westerner would have come to think about what a god is. But essentially all of those souls that get upgraded into godhood status, they become essentially extra hands to help run what apparently is a bureaucracy of the heavenly spiritual realm. So there's a lot to unpack with this story. The first, and I think the most obvious, is the idea of surrendering so far into hedonism, King Zhou. I don't think there's much I need to say about that. There are numerous cultures, numerous religions, whatever lens you view it through. There's usually some kind of spiritual lesson about not letting sloth or lust cloud your judgment. The other thing that I also mentioned when I talked about Romance of the Three Kingdoms was how repetitive these scenes of combat are. And surprisingly, even though the 3 Chinese books that I've read, that would be Three Kingdoms, Water Margin, and now this, were written by different people in such different times, yet somehow the descriptions of these massive battles all have a similar tone to them, and it just gets repetitive no matter which novel I listen to it with. The descriptions of the battles and formations from the second half of Water Margin felt very similar to the descriptions from Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And then Investiture of the Gods. Yes, granted, the generals and the officers of the army, there's tons of Taoist there with magical powers, magical artifacts going head to head, having these supernatural combat scenes. But even so, the descriptions of big battles, armies lined up facing each other, feels strikingly similar to those other two books. And to that point, I will bring up something that actually the narrator of Chinese Lore Podcast, when he did that conclusions episode for this book, he himself brought up that it felt like there were never any serious stakes to the war, which I think is on a similar note to my observation here, but not entirely the same. He mentions that the lack of serious stakes does make the story feel repetitive. Granted, I am glad that I listened through it all, and got to the main points at the end that sort of tie the whole story together. But putting all that aside, something else that this has in common with both Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin is it's a blending of history and mythology. If I'm not mistaken, the setting of this book is older than the other two, which when considered makes sense as a reason for why this includes even more mythology, even more magical elements than those other two. It's further back in time, sort of shrouded in how much of the descriptions given by these ancient writers is real and how much is fantasy fiction. And when I considered that question, it instantly brought to mind a podcast by Dan Carlin on the history of Alexander the Great, which, if you want to compare what it's like to have a Western historical/mythological, we're not quite sure, story from a Western perspective, that Dan Carlin podcast on Alex the Great is a great place to go. Just like this story of how the Shang dynasty ended and the Zhou dynasty began. Obviously, it's hard to believe that so many magical people with magical abilities participated in this war, but still, how much of this is non-fiction? That's the big question that, if we're looking at the historical side of this, that's something that's interesting to sort of parse out. And if I'm not mistaken, this one actually does have a more non-fiction historical account that is written for it that can be compared to the story itself with all the magical elements included. But I mentioned the historical side of it to also mention that, from what I can tell, these ancient Chinese novels are really, really big on telling various parts of their history in this way, which I see as one big place where Eastern and Western literature really contrast one another. Because if you look at some of the biggest writers in the West, we have Shakespeare, Chaucer, Jules Verne, Mark Twain. Those are the people whose writings still hold Western attention hundreds of years after their death, and their writings have much less history, much less nonfiction in them. So this is a place where I feel like my Western mind has a hard time wrapping itself around the concept of the history of this or that Chinese dynasty being such a central part of Chinese literature that's meant to be written for entertainment. One could say, I'm American of course, one could say that we just are not an old enough nation to have stories that are old enough to be blended with mythology in that way. Which, okay, fair enough, because if I look at some places in Europe, there's the story of King Arthur, there's the Iliad. There are stories like that from various cultures in Europe that are both popular in the modern day and old enough that the historical account is blended with mythology. But even so, I don't think those stories are necessarily the biggest or the most central cultural stories. Like, if I was starting a podcast with the goal of translating popular Western stories into Chinese for a Chinese audience, the only reason I wouldn't go with Shakespeare would be it would be very hard to transmit iambic pentameter to that other language. Other than that, Shakespeare would probably be my number one choice. I would look to Jules Verne, I would look to George Orwell, I would look definitely to Tolkien, definitely to C.S. Lewis, probably Mark Twain as well. Those are the kinds of stories I would look to. So it's just hard for me to relate to that kind of infatuation with an oral tradition about your nation's history surviving so long in pop culture. And by the way, yes, like Water Margin, this is technically written down, but primarily, from what I understand at least, it was meant to be told as an oral story. So that being the nature of it, the story does change depending on the time, depending on the narrator. And this is one point that I really like the direction that this narrator is going. I like that he's taking the initiative, owning it as an oral story that he has some amount of creative control over, and making particular choices such as keeping the part about the souls of all the dead heroes going to heaven to become bureaucrats. Spoilers until the end, which, according to what he tells me. That is not told that way in the book, and now after hearing at the end that that's how it turns out, not only that, but all of the deaths were preordained, they literally had a list of names at the very beginning that most readers, just not listeners of this particular narration, would have known about since the beginning of the story. But finding that out at the end makes me want to go back and listen to large parts of it again just to better understand the characters' thoughts and motivations in the context of this new knowledge that they knew all along. And speaking of preordained deaths, this story element, this concept, when I was thinking it over, feels very similar to another book series that I've been reading quite recently, in fact alongside this book. That is the Earth's Children series by Jean M. Auel. The setting of those books is Neolithic Europe, if I'm not mistaken around 40,000 BC, the time when Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe, during the Ice Age when glaciers still covered much of the Northern Hemisphere. Now, the hypothetical religious beliefs and religious customs that she gave to these historical fiction societies, the way they might have conducted their spiritual life, she describes, whenever a character dies, the spirit of the mother, that is, the great Earth Mother, the central creation goddess, the central, most significant deity to their life, the one that all the Venus figurines are meant to represent. They say that the mother misses her children, so she calls them back when it's their time to go. And that made me think about how many other stories do humans tell themselves and tell to each other. Some variant of, this death was preordained, it was meant to happen, all men must die, we are created from dust, and to dust we shall return. How often do humans say some variant of that? And it got me thinking that might be some sort of deep-seated coping mechanism in these really old stories from lots of different cultures for how to deal with death. I did mention Jesus, of course, but also this story itself. Both of these, and I'm sure other examples, are from the Axial Age. That is the time period of 1,000 or 2,000 years when a lot of different cultures from all around the world, all seemingly at the same time, had leaps forward in both philosophy and religion. These central figures, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, Plato, Confucius, and of course this Taoist book. I believe this was written down many centuries after the story was first created and told as an oral story, and of course many centuries after the actual historical events. So these stories have been floating around for long parts of the Axial Age before finally being written down into a complete novel. Another concept I wanted to explore, if you remember back when I talked about Water Margin, I had the big central word overarching that entire story, at least what I read from it. That central word was subjectivity. I observed in how the characters interacted with one another, whether they praised a different character or insulted a different character. Those praises and insults on their own told you almost nothing about the character that's being praised or insulted. What it tells you instead is something about the relationship of the character that's speaking with the character that's being spoken about. So it creates this whole environment where words, either praises or insults, lose their meaning to such an extent that the reader really starts to doubt if right is really right, if wrong is really wrong. And by the end of that book, I felt like the author was really arguing for a might makes right type of philosophy. Maybe I was reading into that too much. I will contrast that subjectivity with this book, though. I don't know, maybe it's because the protagonist of the book had a good ending. I'm not really sure, but it feels like there was really a right and a wrong. We see the villain, that last monarch of the Shang dynasty, descending into complete depravity. Meanwhile, we see the people on the other side acting much more virtuous in comparison. So, while the people on the battlefield still threw insults at one another, both of them called each other traitor. That word pretty much lost its meaning. This novel, contrasting Water Margin, does seem to have a clear right and a clear wrong, at least in how the author portrayed it. Which brings us into our next topic, which is the mandate of heaven, which, according to the supplemental information that the narrator gave, this concept which has a long history in Chinese history and politics, according to what he said, this is where that term really originated. It's the concept that the divine will of heaven favors virtuous rulers, and a ruler can lose the divine will of heaven by giving into their vices and acting in either an unvirtuous or a tyrannical manner. And I wanted to explore that more by trying to find Western comparisons. Now, I don't think Westerners have really a term that is a good match for mandate of heaven, at least in how we speak and how we think about things. But understanding that term, I do see it played out in several places in history. A good example is King John of England, the King John, who made his vassals so angry that they got together and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Of course, the American Revolution as well. There comes a time in human events where we must dissolve the bonds, etc., etc. And this flows nicely into one of the specific questions that the narrator was asked, and he addressed during that final wrap-up episode of this series. It was about the conflict that a lot of the characters in this book faced between loyalty to their lord, or their king, and loyalty to the will of heaven. There are a lot of places in this book where characters reason with themselves and others by saying, King Zhou has done so much for my family, so much for me, the Shang dynasty has done so much for my family, how can I even think of betraying them? As opposed to someone on the other side saying, here's this long list of crimes that King Zhou has committed, he has clearly lost the will of heaven, heaven itself is conspiring against him, the vassals are turning against him, he has lost the momentum, he's on the wrong side of the pendulum swing, so to speak. And one thing I wanted to bring up from Western thought surrounding this, of course, is Christianity. I believe it's Matthew chapter 22, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Meaning we are to obey earthly laws, we are to obey the commands of our government even if that government is tyrannical, the exception being when the commands of the government directly go against the commands of God. That is further fleshed out in the epistles. Jesus was speaking to people at a time when the Jewish people were subjugated by the Roman Empire, and the epistles were written by people who were literally on the run for their lives. Many of them were murdered for spreading the word of Jesus. Paul himself was imprisoned for a long period of time, and these people wrote that we are to obey our governments even if they're tyrannical. So that is a powerful message from Christian thought, from Western thought, that contrasts this idea that we see written out in this book, that an unvirtuous ruler will not be able to keep his vassals in line, and that's just the way of the world. That's just how things go. A good vassal chooses his ruler, compared to the Christian viewpoint, which is more centered on service and stewardship. I didn't want to end there, though, and as much as I do try to keep my political points separate from my book review videos and my history videos, I think this particular book review really does call for a modern political example when we're talking about this question of loyalty to the state versus loyalty to heaven itself. The two most recent American presidents, Biden and Trump, both of them have been called illegitimate. Both of them have had either real or alleged violent acts carried out against them personally or their administration or both. And if someone was really trying, they could easily come up with a long list of crimes for either one of them. Reasons to say that they have lost the will of heaven, they are unvirtuous, they do not deserve to rule or to govern. With Biden, he's a neoliberal. He has had one of the longest political careers there was. A lot of people say he's corrupt. He hangs out with corrupt people. His family has been involved in a lot of scandals. There's lots of video of him in public acting strangely around underage people, I'll put it that way. There was an event during Biden's term in office where a bag of cocaine was found in the White House, and it is not publicly known where it came from or whose it was. There was an event during Biden's term where a transsexual individual was invited to the White House lawn where they took their shirt off and paraded around topless. Lots can be said about whether or not it was fair what was done to the January 6 prisoners. Lots can be said about his competence as a foreign diplomat. And then, of course, there's just the slap in the face to Christians. That Transgender Day of Remembrance, the one year, happened to fall on the same day as Easter Sunday, and that was celebrated by the White House. Contrast it with Trump, lots of people say that he does not have good business ethics. Of course, he's had divorces. He has been known in the past to be a womanizer. He has sexual assault allegations. And of course, if you don't like the policy positions that he's advancing while in office, I really pity you because he's getting a lot done in this second term. So either one of those leaders, one could make a case that they have lost the will of heaven. And lots of people do for both of them, maybe not in those exact words, but both of them have been called illegitimate, and there have been significant attempts at civil disobedience during both of their terms to both of their policies. But that could all be explained by just saying that Americans love to argue about politics. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I really enjoyed going through Investiture of the Gods and the thoughts that came up while reading that, so I wanted to get those out here in a video. Thank you again to Chinese Lore Podcast for narrating that. I look forward to the day when Journey to the West is finished. See you next time.